Mansplaining, that's obviously sort of become quite an everyday word now. What are the ways that women can combat that then?
Right, so
if someone is mansplaining at you.
So for those who don't know, mansplaining, which is not a word that I came up with, is a man explaining something to you in a pedantic or condescending manner. And arguably, mansplaining or splaining to women has existed since the dawn of time. But what I find really interesting about this is that it's only been in the last 5 years or so that there has been a word put onto this behavior. And it was a term that emerged from the internet, and then the writer Rebecca Solnit wrote an essay about it called Men Explain Things to Me. And suddenly, and in that story, it's worth noting, she was at a party, she had written a book, and this man was explaining to her that she should really check out this new book that's out, if she hasn't, because it's really good, and he wouldn't let her get a word in to explain that it was her book, in fact. And actually, he hadn't really read it. There are all of these different funny terminology and a lot of puns. I'm a pun expert these days. And they're meant to be playful, but I think there is something very valuable about having a term to call out really complex behaviors. Because once you have the word, and it's kind of a playful word, it rolls off the tongue, it's maybe even fun to say, you can call it out. And so once the idea of mansplaining existed and became part of the pop lexicon, then you see women in your daily work environments calling people out for doing it. And for that matter, a woman could mansplain too as well. On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow is calling out people for mansplaining on air. And suddenly it's this thing that everybody recognizes, everyone acknowledges, and you can identify the behavior and bring attention to it. So I actually think there's a really important linguistic tool in calling out these behaviors and simply bringing attention to them. Because the reality is, I think a lot of these things people just do. They may not even realize they're happening. And so some of this is pointing the behavior out when it's happening so that people can correct it for the next time.
The man-interrupter. Now, obviously, pretty much the most famous man-interrupter right now is Trump. So yes, man-interrupter.
So I feel like we've all heard this phrase by now and we've seen it play out. But what I just go back to is, this is real. Like, there is a pattern to this behavior. Women are twice as likely to be interrupted when they speak by both women and men. So it's a real problem, and it affects women more commonly. We saw Hillary Clinton kind of step back and just let him speak so that the rest of us could view his absurdity as it took place. But it was interesting to watch the trajectory, because in the first debate, you notice for the first, 10 or 15 minutes or so, she was trying to talk over him because his voice is louder and he will shout. And she is so careful to be factual in everything that she says that she can't speak as quickly. It's very easy to get stuff out in a powerful way if you don't care about the consequences of what you're saying. So it was interesting to me to watch the trajectory, because one of the fight moves for combating this, do not stop talking. It's like the cars. You're just going to keep going. You are not going to give up. But she eventually took another approach, which was to stand back and let him dig his own grave. So that is one way to deal with it. Another really effective tool is to have somebody else chime in on your behalf. It's very easy as a woman to be perceived as overly sensitive or naggy or not taking it the right way if you're the one to be like, hey, I'm speaking right now, can you let me finish? But if you're speaking and you get interrupted and I'm like, hey, can you let her finish what she was saying? Then it makes me sort of look like a good person and a good colleague, and it lets you finish your point, and it gets the other person to hopefully shut up.
Okay, now we've spoken a lot about men, but also, of course, a lot of women self-sabotage in the workplace as well. Sometimes we don't do ourselves any favours. So we're going to talk a bit about that as well. I think we should start with imposter. Imposter. I think that's a lot of women. I'll start this by saying Maya Angelou, Tina Fey, Michelle Obama, and Meryl Streep all have this problem. They've all confessed to it. So tell us about imposter.
Yeah, so imposter syndrome is a psychological term for feeling like you don't belong or feeling like you don't deserve to be there. Perhaps it's getting a promotion and not being sure that you actually deserved it. But this is a real thing, and it affects women, people of color, members of the LGBT population, any member of a minority group more commonly, because those groups have the pressure in some way of feeling like they must accomplish firsts. And so I've experienced this so many times throughout my career, and for a long time there wasn't a word for it. And now there is, and so I think people are talking about it more commonly. And like you said, people like Michelle Obama think that they aren't qualified or don't belong. Tina Fey says she feels this all the time. Meryl Streep, who's won the most Oscars, I think, of any other person or woman, every time she's like, why are they asking me to be in this movie? Like, who am I? And so it's absurd that people like that still feel this. But it's very common. And I think that the reality is, whenever I talk about self-sabotage, I try to make the point that it's not women's fault. Like, over hundreds of years, we have been taught by culture that we are supposed to be modest, and we are not leaders, we are nurturers. And these things are easy to internalize. And so I think a lot of this self-sabotaging behavior is rooted in the fact that for so long we weren't allowed to hold positions of power. And so we've internalized it and we act it out in some ways. So there are some things that we can do to overcome some of these behaviors, while at the same time I think recognizing that the onus shouldn't be on women to correct their behavior. But if that's going to work and be practical in the moment, then my feeling is it can't hurt.